Two choices stood before him: walk back to safety and let 600 enemy soldiers live, or stay forward, risk everything, and call thunder down onto his own position. He chose the latter, a choice that would decide the fate of a battalion and mark one man for a lifetime of quiet after the war. If you value forgotten stories of heroism, hit like to help us share them. First Lieutenant Garland Merl Connor was not a mythic hero sculpted for headlines. He was a 25-year-old tobacco farmer from Kentucky, 5'6" and wiry from field work, a man who had never finished high school, but who had learned in a much harsher classroom how to survive. He had been in combat before. His record showed grit and hard luck, wounded multiple times, braided with decorations earned by simply getting up each morning and answering the next order. Those who served with him remembered a low, steady presence, precise, unassuming, ready to move when duty demanded it. The place was the Camar Pocket, near Houston, France. The date, January 24th, 1945. The winter sat heavy on the ground, temperatures near 10 degrees below zero, the trees skeletal, the earth crusted with ice and snow. The Allies were still reeling from last year's campaigns. Operation Nordwind, the late December counteroffensive, had left the front lines jagged, units shuffled, pockets of danger and opportunity folded into an unforgiving landscape. For Connor's unit, the stakes that morning were simple and terrible. Hold the line, keep the enemy from cutting the battalion in two, and prevent a rout that would cost lives and ground. At 0700 a German barrage began, the sky filled with concussion and the forest with splintered wood. Shells slammed into the tree line, snow erupted into brown showers where rounds struck. A runner, breath steaming in the cold, made it through the shelling to the forward command. Reconnaissance had spotted a massing force, a formation with 6 Tiger tanks and 600 infantry, closing to counterattack. Those numbers were not casual. A Tiger was more than a heavy tank. It was the apex of armored engineering of the German army then. Thick armor, and a gun that could punch through American vehicles at a distance. For infantry caught without armor, the approach of such beasts and the infantry they shielded was a slow-moving calamity. There was more than force to worry about. There was position. The battalion had no forward observer in place. The eyes that translate map coordinates into lethal accuracy for the artillery 3 miles back. Without that forward observer, the artillery could not place precise, purposeful fires onto the massing German formation. Artillery is terrifyingly effective when guided. Without a spotter near the enemy, shells risk wasting away in the trees or falling harmlessly short. The options narrowed to the grim arithmetic of the battlefield. Either accept that the enemy would close without accurate artillery to stop them, or find a way to provide those eyes at dreadful risk. Connor volunteered. His method was old and simple: telephone wire, a crank handset, and the human will to hold the line. He picked up a spool of field wire, slung it over his shoulder, and took the phone. The distance he had to cross: 400 yards of open ground. It is an image that compresses all the reasons young men die in war. No cover, the white field like a target, the enemy's guns trained outward to sweep that very space. Shells were already landing around him as he moved. Trees once straight and steady became ragged silhouettes under blast. Snow flew up in moons, where rounds struck the crust. The spool of wire unrolled with his stride. A thin lifeline stretched out behind him, the metal thread that would connect him to the men who could answer the sight of the enemy with thunder. Running that distance in winter under artillery fire is not cinematic bravado. It is a succession of micro-decisions: where to put your foot, when to change direction, how to keep the spool from tangling, how not to let the handset get wet in a world where moisture and metal are lethal partners. He moved with his training and whatever calm habit war had given him. Shells sounded like distant doors slamming, close enough for the concussion to ring in the ears, far enough that the air was full of dangerous stillness between booms. He knew the risk. He must have known, in a way every forward observer knows, that being the eyes for the battery makes you the most dangerous man on the map. He reached a shallow ditch, a scrape worn as much by terrain as by the footsteps of others, and made it his post. There was little cover, a hollow in a snowfield, a place that might admit a man's body but not hide it from a tank gun. He unspooled the wire, cranked the phone, and called the fire direction center. On the other end were the artillerymen, 3 miles back, Massive guns that could rain shells across fields, if someone could tell them exactly where to put them. The first rounds were not perfect. Without a forward observer before him, the battery had to take correction after correction. Drop 100, left 50, add 200. Each voice on the line was a calibrating hand, narrowing the gap between where shells fell and where they needed to be. Artillery adjustments are a conversation of angles and distances. Translate, observe, correct. The simplest analogy is this. If the battlefield is a map and the map is in someone else's hands, the observer is the person pointing to the place that must burn. Sometimes those place markers are miles away. Sometimes, as that day, they are terrifyingly close. The Germans moved out into the open. Their Tigers came across once hidden berms into sight like dark, low islands rolling beneath the pale sky. The infantry that followed filled the ground between the tanks, a grinding mass closing like a zipper. Their purpose was simple: punch through, roll the flank, collapse the sector. For Connor, once the first precise salvos started to find their range, the calculus of danger sharpened. Adjustments made the difference between discomfort and disaster. Shells began to land among the attackers, throwing men and material into disarray. But every adjustment that put fire closer to the German formation also put it closer to him. A familiar, chilling phrase entered the exchange. The term soldiers reserve for the last, most desperate option: danger close. It is a technical term. In modern doctrine, it denotes a threshold where friendly forces are within a specified minimum distance of the target, requiring extra confirmation and acceptance of risk. In the moment, it is the sound that says the observer is willing to accept shells landing within yards of his own foxhole to stop the enemy. It is the point at which professional judgment and moral hazard converge. Connor understood that. He understood that to truly halt the German advance, the artillery fire had to be placed not vaguely in the massing formation, but into the teeth of it, into the ground the tanks traveled and the infantry would soon occupy. He took the corrections, relayed them, watched the first real impact, a cratering that folded men and snow into black hollows, a Tiger staggered by a lucky or skillful hit in its track, another hit that stalled a crew and left metal hunched in the open. The rhythm of the battle became a loop: observe, call, adjust, wait, watch the consequences, then call again. Each radio call tightened the ring. At one point, as shells came dangerously close and the enemy tried to reorganize, Connor made the precise, stark command that the transcripts preserve: fire on my position. The handset pressed to his ear held the weight of that sentence. Those words are not theater. They are a documented, calm, professional imperative, the language that translates the choice before him into action. By saying them, he called fire on his own position. The battery registered the coordinates. The guns registered the command. And then, the mechanics of war, steel and powder and trajectory, took over. If that moment is the pivot, what lay before it is the moral dialectic the title frames so bluntly: the two choices. One was to abandon the forward ground, to pull back and let the massing formations roll across empty shell-pocked fields. Withdrawal would likely have preserved the life of the observer, maybe several lives in the immediate footprint, but at a tactical cost: the battering of the battalion's flank, the collapse of defensive cohesion, possible rout, and higher total casualties across the unit. The other was to remain forward, to place oneself between artillery and enemy, to accept the very real probability of death or grievous wound so that the artillery could hit where it would matter most. That binary, sacrifice or survival, frames the drama in stark moral terms. Make no mistake, it is a dramatic framing, not a moralizing of motive. Historical documents do not say Connor was on a crusade to kill. They show a soldier making a professional, often coldly rational decision in the lethal arithmetic of combat. Where can our fire be most effective, and what risk is necessary to allow it? The historical record makes clear the direction he took. He stayed forward, and he called fire onto positions at ranges that put him within the danger zone. He directed artillery for 3 hours from an exposed position. That phrase, from the citation, is exact and sobering. 3 hours is a long time to be the focal point of counterfire. It is a long time to hold one's breath while the line between friend and target narrows. The time pressure and the layering of threats were relentless. German counter-battery fire tried to zero in on the observer. The Tigers, once their tracks were immobilized, became targets for concentrated artillery rounds and American infantry anti-tank efforts. The infantry, meanwhile, tried to skirt the shattered metal and close on the friendly lines. At points, the private who had volunteered to help Connor crawled forward with more wire and sat within the ditch beside him. His presence was a human seam joining observer and battery, a small companionship against the enormous machinery of war. That private, like so many others in the thin, brutal narratives of combat, bore the cost. Under bombardment, he was injured while moving to and from the position, an immediate example of how risk multiplied across the unit. There were technical limits as well. Artillery ammunition is not infinite in a field army. Patterns of fire that are sustained for hours deplete stocks and force commanders to prioritize targets. Radios and phones can fail in cold or under shock. The enemy can adapt, disperse, feint. Yet the presence of a forward observer who can call danger close buys time and creates decisive effects that pooling artillery cannot achieve from blind coordinates. It forces the enemy to change approach or pay the price of consolidation. Tanks immobilized, infantry broken under a rain of adjusted salvos. As the minutes and hours of that morning stretched, Connor's voice over the phone was the small, human constant, tethering the monstrous guns behind the lines to the field unfolding in his sight. Shells landed within yards of his shallow ditch. Snow that had been white became pocked and gray with earth, then black with carbon and shrapnel after repeated impacts. The battlefield's soundscape was now a chorus of reverberations, guns, the shriek of artillery, the muffled thuds of rounds, the occasional sharp report of a tank's gun. Yet the human voice on the phone kept threading adjustments into lethal precision. The immediate tactical picture began to change. Some Tigers were hit, and not merely scratched. An immobilized tank is a strategic defeat in itself. Its crew vulnerable, its weight a dead anchor in the open. Reports later described Tigers disabled and abandoned, their crews punished by the elements or forced to flee on foot or in other vehicles. Infantry columns, once having believed the tanks would shield them, found gaps opening where well-placed artillery rounds had shredded cohesion. Estimates would later place enemy losses in hundreds, cautionary, labeled as after-action estimates, not exact counts. What mattered in that moment was the visible effect. The assault was losing momentum where it should have been growing. But the cost was immediate and personal. The repeated fires near his position put Connor at constant risk. The private who had helped him moved back and forth across the open ground and was hit while bringing additional wire. The cold bit through uniforms. Hands numb diminished the ability to operate equipment with mechanical certainty. Yet the calls continued. The battery answered each time, shells screaming in to contest the ground the Germans hoped to take. For a long period, the observer's calculus was both tactical and moral. Keep calling, keep adjusting, accept the increasing odds against survival because the alternative, withdrawal, meant giving the enemy the initiative and possibly sacrificing the wider formation. There are images that stick. Connor cranking the handset with one hand while clutching the spool with the other. The handset cord taut, a lifeline between eyes and guns. The shallow ditch acting both as shelter and as the center of a radius of risk. The maps of the day would later be measured in craters and abandoned metal. Men in the battalion, watching from minutes or miles away, would later remember a silence and then the gradual unraveling of the German assault. Men walking back from where they had expected to press forward, tanks left hulking and useless on the white field. In the tight, urgent reporting of the time, the sequence was clear. Connor ran the 400 yards. He connected the telephone wire. He established the forward observation post. He adjusted artillery with precise corrections. He accepted the danger close thresholds, and he called fire on his own position. It is a phrase that historians and military men use with a mixture of technical respect and emotional weight. The immediate effect was to blunt the assault. The broader effect, unseen to the men at the time, would be to keep the battalion from breaking and to save lives that would otherwise have been lost in the chaos of a successful German breakthrough. Recognition did not come instantly in grand ceremonies. For the action on January 24, 1945, he received formal commendation. The Distinguished Service Cross was presented to him on February 10, 1945, by Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, an acknowledgement from his superiors of the specific valor shown in that freezing terrain. Yet recognition in paperwork is not the same as recognition lived and remembered. Connor left France on March 15, 1945, and was discharged on June 22, 1945. He returned to a small Kentucky farm, to tobacco fields and the quiet, weathered business of making a living. He did not parade his medals. Those decorations went into a box, then a cardboard container, then back into a drawer, emblematic of a man who had done what needed doing, and then wanted the rest of his life to be ordinary. Years after the war, his wife Pauline found what had been tucked away and began to ask questions that would ripple through decades. What had really happened that day? Why had the commendation not been upgraded? Why did so much of the story seem invisible? Researchers and veterans advocates, Richard Chilton among them, would piece together after-action reports and witness statements, following the thin threads of documentation and memory. The institutional path to upgrading a decoration is not automatic. It is mired in paperwork, deadlines, and often the loss of first-hand witnesses. For decades, those hurdles kept Connor's actions from achieving the full national recognition some believed they merited. Only after years of advocacy, research, and legal steps, Congress had to waive time limits, appeals had to be filed and sustained, did the story re-enter official orbit with force. The ultimate correction came many years later, and the final public act occurred in Washington, the Medal of Honor presentation, June 26, 2018. Pauline, who had carried the story in her heart and pushed for years, received the medal on his behalf. It was a bittersweet closure. The nation had finally recognized the particular valor of that January morning, but the man himself had spent most of his life content with quiet dignity, and he had died on November 5, 1998. Yet none of that belongs only to the epilogue. In the ditch on January 24th, with snow grinding into the seams of his uniform, with tanks looming and infantry surging, Connor made his choice. The title poses a stark, almost theatrical framing. Two choices: sacrifice himself or save the 600 Germans, and the framing is, by design, provocative. It compresses a complex tactical decision into a moral binary to draw attention. The truth lies in the overlap. Tactical necessity and moral courage are not strangers on a battlefield. He did not call fire out of malice. He did not aim at a philosophical end. He acted to stop a threatening force, 6 Tiger tanks and 600 infantry, because the best chance for the battalion's survival required it. The record shows what he did. He risked his life by calling in artillery at dangerously close ranges, and he directed artillery for 3 hours from an exposed position. As snow continued to fall that morning and the radios clicked with coordinates, the battle entered a phase of furious, constrained exchange. Shells fell and were adjusted. The German commanders tried to change targets, to flank, to bring their armored weight to bear. The artillerymen 3 miles back cranked their own levers and aimed their own arcs, trusting the voice on the other end. The private who had crawled up with extra wire lay injured nearby. Medics were performing what they could while remaining under threat. Connor's hands, numb with cold and worn by the repeated handling of the handset, did not tremble as he spoke the corrections. He understood that every word could be the difference between a cluster of rounds landing where they would wound a few individuals or striking precisely where they would break the massing formation's momentum. For the men in the battalion who watched the fight evolve, the scene was confusing until it was not. At first, the barrage's noise suggested success for the Germans. Then, as rounds found tracks and clustered around columns, the tide shifted. The Tigers, once an imposing sight, began to show signs of being penalized by concentrated artillery. Some stopped, some burned, some were left in a way that made them immobile and irrelevant. Infantry formations, caught in the open under continuous adjusted artillery, could not reform effectively. The assault's tempo decreased. The shells that had been a terror for a few minutes became a deterrent against further pressing of the attack. The battle was not over. 3 hours of directing artillery sounds like a long, precise grind, and it was. But the real metric was the change in the German intent. That change was what the battalion needed. Yet for Connor, those hours were an exposure to the worst the front could offer, a stationary focus under an enemy who was angry, capable, and close. When terrain offered no shelter, a man must become a decision. He became that decision. At a certain point during that morning, As rounds closed and the enemy's cohesion began to fray, there came a hard, professional silence over the phone. Then a confirmation from the battery, a steady acknowledgement that fire was on the requested coordinates. The mechanics did as ordered. The guns adjusted, rounds arced, and the ground between the lines became lethal in a way that favored the defenders for the moment. It is in these minutes that the moral stakes of the title become flesh. A man, small against winter and steel, had called for fire that would land dangerously close. He had taken the present risk rather than gamble on a larger collapse. He had made the choice. Even as the battle continued to churn, even while the artillery's answers reverberated through the trees, the decision had already begun to cast its shadow forward. Commanders later noted in reports that the battalion's position held. Medics later tallied casualties and noted that the unit had not been overrun. The direct, temporal cause and effect of the artillery strikes were not a tidy equation. War rarely is, but the combination of a forward observer willing to call danger close and an artillery battery able to adjust and sustain fire had changed the probable outcomes that morning. This is the terrain where history insists on nuance. The title's binary, sacrifice versus saving the enemy, works rhetorically, but risks simplifying the professional soldier's calculation. Connor did not linger on whether the enemy would live or die. He acted because his role, as he saw it, was to create the conditions for his battalion's survival. In doing so, he accepted the moral weight that comes with calling in lethal force within friend range. To the men who survived and to the family back home, the act took on a deeper moral luster. To military professionals, it was a measure of decision under fire. Both are true. By mid-morning, the sounds on the field had changed from the raw staccato of an advancing force to the ragged, intermittent reports of a force that could no longer maintain its rhythm. Reports that would later be compiled into after-action estimates suggested heavy enemy losses, numbers given as estimates, not exact accounts, and described abandoned vehicles and scattered infantry. But the violence was not complete. The field still lay dangerous and uncertain. Connor's voice, the spool of wire, the handset, these remained in the hollow where a man had decided to stay. It is at this juncture, when artillery had answered and the ground had shifted but before the final tally and the long bureaucratic arc of recognition began, that the first part of this story finds its natural pause. The cold, the wire, the handset, they remained. The battle's outcome was tilting, but the cost and the full consequence had yet to be sealed. What followed would be the paperwork, the denunciations and endorsements, the Distinguished Service Cross presentation on February 10, 1945, and, much later, a campaign that culminated in Pauline receiving recognition decades afterward, events that would both honor and complicate the memory of that morning. For now, in the ditch with snow packed at his shoulders and the world reduced to coordinates and corrections, Garland Merl Connor made a decision that embodied the terrible clarity of combat. He chose to stand in the danger zone and translate sight into fire. He chose to keep the battalion in the fighting line rather than gamble on retreat. In doing so, he became a fulcrum on which lives and the map turned. The rest of the story, what that decision cost, how it rippled through time, and how memory would finally catch up with the facts, would take years, lawyers, historians, and one determined wife to unfold. But it began in that shallow ditch on January 24, 1945, with a spool of wire in one hand and a handset in the other, and the clear recorded command that would mark the day: "Fire on my position." The guns kept answering until the sky seemed to hold their echoes. When the final adjusted salvos thudded into the tree line, and the measured rhythm of artillery fire became a staccato of intermittent reports, the immediate calculus of survival shifted. Men who had been braced for the worst found themselves squinting across a field littered with blackened metal and shattered snow, trying to make sense of tanks that no longer moved and infantry columns that would not close. For a time the air smelled of burnt powder and cold earth, and the small noises of men checking boots and adjusting straps filled the hollow where, hours earlier, only the thunder of guns had spoken. Word moved along the lines in fits. Tigers immobilized, abandoned metal hulked in the white. Enemy infantry pushed back or dissolving into the woods, the battalion's flank still intact. Commanders who had feared the worst now had reason, cautious, measured, to breathe. Reports would be written, maps annotated, and eyewitness statements collected. The immediate need was to account for wounded, gather the dead, and hold the ground that daylight and artillery had preserved. Medics worked under a winter sun that did little to warm frozen fingers, men piling into shelters where they could, the private who had crawled up with Connor receiving the attention his injuries required. The man who had held the line in that shallow ditch, who had called fire on his own position, was not, in the hours that followed, singled out with fanfare amid ongoing fighting. In combat, even decisive acts get folded into the next set of tasks. The official process, when it did unfold, was bureaucratic in the way institutions must be. Witness statements gathered, endorsements exchanged, a citation drafted. Yet the simplest and most direct recognition came soon enough. On February 10, 1945, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch presented Garland Merl Connor with the Distinguished Service Cross. It was a formal acknowledgement of a defined act of valor, an award whose citation would note that he directed artillery for 3 hours from an exposed position. For the men who had been there, the award was right. For Connor, it was a piece of paper that validated what his comrades already knew. He accepted it, and then, like so many soldiers who wanted to return to the ordinary pulley of peacetime life, began the slow process of going home. Connor left France on March 15, 1945. By June 22, 1945, he was discharged from the army and back where he had started, the small Kentucky farm, tobacco rows, the patient and cyclic tasks of planting and harvest. He returned to a life that demanded the sorts of small attentions that erased the loud momentum of war, mending fences, negotiating weather, balancing bills. The medals came with him, but did not define him. They were set aside in boxes, then a drawer, then a cardboard container that migrated into the attic with the rest of a life's detritus. Those items, metallic and quiet, would stay there for decades, a private archive of public danger. For years, the story of that January morning remained, for most the story of a single citation and an ordinary man who had done an extraordinary duty. Connor himself did not rehearse it. He did not seek recognition in the public square. To neighbors and family, he was the farmer who mended a fence, who could fix a tractor, who would not be easily drawn into boasting. That reticence, common among veterans who survived carnage and returned to civilian roles, meant that much of the detail of that day lived in official reports and the memories of those who had served alongside him. It took quiet work over years to knit that scattered documentation back into a public narrative of the kind that can persuade institutions to re-examine decisions. Pauline Connor, the woman who shared his life, became the story's persistent steward. She found the boxes, opened them, and began to ask questions that would not be easily answered by a cardboard container. Why had the commendation not been upgraded? Why did the paperwork seem thin in the places that mattered? Why had an action that in some veterans' eyes merited the highest recognition remained catalogued under an award that, while prestigious, did not match the scale of daring the witnesses described? Those questions are the beginning of many such campaigns. A spouse or child notices an omission, a researcher becomes interested, papers are pulled from dusty files, and people who remember begin to talk. Richard Chilton, one of the researchers who later would examine the case, followed leads in records and after-action reports, cross-checking unit diaries and locating witnesses. Private Gordon Roberts surfaced as one link in the chain, a veteran whose testimony and connection helped create narrative momentum. Together with others, they reconstructed the sequence from the dials of the Fire Direction Center to the spat of artillery into the tree line. The essential facts, the 400 yards of open ground, the 6 Tiger tanks, the massing of roughly 600 infantry, the recorded command, "Fire on my position," were anchors that made the case tangible. Institutional recognition, however, is not simply a matter of establishing facts. Awards like the Medal of Honor have rigorous administrative criteria and time limits for nomination and approval. For many veterans of World War II, the passing decades made those time limits a practical obstacle. Forms were not filed, witnesses died, witnesses' memories dimmed. Legal and regulatory hurdles can be as implacable as enemy guns. That is why Pauline's persistence, and that of researchers and advocates who followed, mattered. They compiled witness statements, secured endorsements, and fought the slow machinery of revision. Some of that fight took place in letters and hearings, in appeals where timelines had to be waived. Congress has an infrequent but established mechanism to relieve administrative time bars. It requires lawmakers to assess not the valiance itself, which is a matter of record, but whether procedural limitations should be set aside to allow deserved recognition. In Connor's case, lawmakers moved to waive those constraints, allowing the administrative process to reopen. That process involved military reviewers, historians, and legal counsel, parsing evidence and precedent. For the Connor family and the advocates who supported them, each cleared hurdle felt like a reprieve, another step closer to rendering visible what had been, for so long, mostly a notation in a file. Recognition finally culminated in a public act decades after the snow fell on that field. The Medal of Honor presentation, June 26, 2018, brought a kind of institutional closure. Pauline, who had carried the story in her mind and in conversations, received the medal on her husband's behalf. The ceremony was a formal, national-level acknowledgement that the action of January 24, 1945, merited the country's highest military decoration. For Pauline, the invite to the ceremony and the medal itself were not merely symbolic. They were the result of years of quiet advocacy, of requesting files from government archives, of interviewing comrades and arranging documentation in a way that would satisfy a careful bureaucracy. There is an unavoidable bittersweetness in such moments. Garland Merl Connor was not alive to accept the nation's highest public recognition. He had died on November 5, 1998. The medal placed on his behalf testified to a valor that had been recognized by peers in a small way soon after the fact, then re-examined by generations of those who cared enough to recover the full measure of what happened. Pauline's receipt of the award on June 26, 2018 closed one arc, the institutional one, and opened another, the one about memory. How societies remember, who gets to decide which acts are visible, and how families steward private sacrifice into public memory. The arc from ditch to White House contains smaller human textures often overlooked in summations of valor. In empathy and in detail, it is worth noting what staying forward cost in ways that are not reducible to decoration. Wounds that did not always visibly show, nights of sleep that remained fitful, the psychological compression that follows men home. Connor lived with the residue of combat. The box of medals in his attic was, for him, a private ledger, proof of duty fulfilled and then set aside. For Pauline, for Richard Chilton, for Private Gordon Roberts, and for those who lent their memories to the record, resurrecting the story was an act of love and of civic service. To refuse that the particulars of a man's sacrifice dissolve into the abstract numbers of war. The story also settles, uneasily, beside the moral question posed bluntly by the title, Two Choices, Sacrifice Himself or Save the 600 Germans. That framing, chosen to sharpen the moral stakes for an audience, must be read with care. It is a dramatic dichotomy. To withdraw would have risked handing the tactical initiative and possibly collapsing the battalion's flank. To stay and call danger close fire risked the observer's life to blunt an assault. Historically, Connor made the latter decision. He did not, by documented evidence, act from any stated aim to save the enemy. He acted to protect his unit and preserve the defensive line. The hypothetical that if he had withdrawn he would have saved the 600 Germans is a provocative lens rather than a literal claim about his intent. It dramatizes the fact that his remaining in place made the battlefield lethal to the attackers. It does not turn his motive into a compassion-driven act for the enemy's sake. He performed his duty by the rules and ethics of combat. Identify the target, accept accepted risks, and allow the fire to be placed where it would most likely protect friendly forces. That distinction matters because it reframes how we grasp military decision-making. Soldiers and leaders do not always face choices that read cleanly as moral absolutes. Many are professional judgments compressed by fear, time, and the impossibility of perfect information. Connor's decision was professional first, an assessment of what needed to be done to blunt a massing armored infantry assault, then moral in its consequences, because it entailed accepting personal danger for the wider good. Presenting it as a binary is rhetorically sharp and useful for storytelling. Honoring the historical truth means recognizing the professional context that shaped the choice. Memory, too, has its own binary, between public acknowledgement and private remembrance. Connor's life after the war demonstrates how many veterans migrate back into the ordinary and leave their extraordinary moments in boxes. The decades-long campaign to upgrade his award shows the work required when public memory fails to keep pace with private deeds. Pauline's commitment became, in effect, a bridge between those two forms of memory. She translated the addict's quiet into paperwork, into interviews, into legislative language that could reopen an administrative case. Her persistence illuminates another truth about how societies honor sacrifice. The act of remembrance is not automatic. It is often the labor of others, sometimes family members, sometimes volunteer researchers, sometimes veterans groups that refuse to let a story go. There is, finally, a lesson in how the military and the public respond to such acts. Awards like the Distinguished Service Cross recognize valor within a framework of military meaning. The Medal of Honor embodies a different set of criteria and a heightened public symbolism. The movement from one to the other is not merely a matter of escalated praise. It is a process that forces institutions to consider evidence, testimony, and moral calculus anew. It is bureaucratic for good and ill. It prevents caprice, but also occasionally delays justice for decades. When the system corrects itself, the correction is significant. But so too is the long delay that makes posthumous recognition the main avenue by which some acts are nationally honored. When looking across decades at the field where the Tigers once rolled, and the phone cord stretched taut, one sees more than tracks and craters. One sees the habits of courage that soldiers develop in combat, the steady voice under pressure, the mechanical competence of hands that keep operating a handset in cold and blood, the decision-making patterns that choose the wider good over personal safety. History records outcomes: disabled tanks, broken assaults, a battalion kept in the line, and those outcomes provide the factual backbone to a moral narrative about sacrifice. But it is the human detail that gives the narrative weight. The spool of wire, the handset cradled against a cheek in sub-zero weather, the brief phrase over the line that commits the guns to a call that puts a man at risk. In the years after, those details moved from field maps into family albums and then into the public record. Archival photographs and official citations became tokens of a day that otherwise would be remembered only by the silent among survivors. For historians and veterans advocates, reconstructing the event required patience, piecing together maps, reading after-action estimates that always, responsibly, labeled enemy casualty numbers as estimates, and corroborating statements from multiple witnesses. For the Connor family, it required persistence and faith that institutions could be persuaded to re-examine their own files. When Pauline stood in a formal place to receive the Medal of Honor on June 26, 2018, she did more than accept a piece of metal. She forced open a closed chapter in a nation's accounting of valor. She made visible what had been boxed and stored. The medal did not reverse the years Connor had lived without that highest public mark of recognition. It did, however, reinsert his name into the national ledger of remembrance, and gave his family and community a public place to point toward when they told the story. There is finally an ethical echo that runs from that ditch to the present. Remembering matters not just for honor's sake, but because memory alters how societies see their past and how they teach future generations the costs and requirements of war. Connor's act was a professional decision with moral consequence. To remember him is to preserve a case study in duty under fire, an example for soldiers, a story for families, and a concrete pattern for historians who try to teach how small choices can redirect larger events. It is tempting, when a single man's courage appears to have turned the tide of a local fight, to elevate the act to myth. That would be an injustice to both history and to Connor. The truth is more complex and, in many ways, more moving. A combination of training, temperament, chance, and professional judgment conspired that day to create an outcome that preserved lives and held a sector of the line. His choice: to remain forward, to accept the hazard of danger-close missions, to direct artillery for 3 hours from an exposed position, was the fulcrum on which that morning's survival balanced. What then of the title's provocative alternative, sparing the attackers? As a hypothetical, it helps illuminate the stakes. Withdrawing might have reduced the immediate risk to a single observer, but could have allowed an assault that cost many more lives across the broader formation. Yet it is important to note that military decisions rarely reduce to a single moral calculus of life for life. They are decisions about probabilities and leverage. Where will the available force buy the most time? Which action preserves the larger number of neutral parties? Connor's action must be read within that lattice of professional assessment, rather than as a simple moral calculus of killing versus saving. Standing back from the technicalities, we can see the human shape of what happened. A small man from Kentucky, scarred by previous wounds and shaped by a life of work, volunteered to stretch a spool of wire across an open snowscape and become, for hours, the human axis connecting a battery's thunder to the enemy's silhouette. He did not act for fame. He acted because it was his job, because a forward observer's role is to see where the fire must go, and to accept, if necessary, that the human price of accuracy might sometimes include personal danger. That is a professional ethic that, when it is mixed with courage, produces stories fit for remembrance. This story is also a reminder of who keeps memory turning. Pauline's decades of asking questions, Richard Chilton's archival persistence, Private Gordon Roberts' willingness to lend his recollections. Each person contributes to the practical, often unglamorous work of conservation. Without them, Connor's cardboard box of medals might have stayed in an attic, the man's extraordinary day reduced to an entry in a ledger. Their labor shows that remembering is active work. It requires witnesses, documents, and people who will not allow the official record to ossify without examination. We end where the story began, with a choice in a shallow ditch on January 24, 1945. Two choices stood before him. One would have been immediate survival for the observer, the other a probable death for the man, but a better chance for his battalion. He made a decision shaped by training, duty, and the terrible arithmetic of combat. Stay, call the battery, and accept the risk. The result was not theatrical in the way stories sometimes are promised to be. It was precise and practical and devastating in its implications. Tanks disabled, infantry mauled, a battalion kept in the line. These were the measurable outcomes. The moral weight remained with the man who had issued the command, and with those who later worked for his public recognition. If this story moves you, leave your location in the comments. Help keep names like Garland Merl Connor alive. Remembering him is not simply about medals. It is about the people who bear the cost of decisions in war, and about the responsibility of those who remain to tell the tale with both accuracy and respect. Two choices stood before him that day. He chose to stand in the danger zone, and history, slow, halting, and eventually correcting, has recorded that choice.